Hello, dear colleagues and friends from across Europe. Welcome at this, what I think, very interesting, fascinating seminar. Before starting, I will share with you a bit of technical information. If you want to have subtitles, then you should activate at the control bar the closed captioning, and then you will see in real time what is said in text. Sometimes that can help to facilitate participation and understanding. If you have comments, then please use the chat box, also available in the control bar. You can activate the chat box by clicking on chat, and then you can post a comment or a remark. If you would like to ask a question, then please use the Q&A button that we also have in the control bar at the bottom of your screen. Good afternoon, everybody, at this webinar on inclusive education and what is the role for the European Union in the way forward. I'm Luc Zelderlo, Secretary General of ESPD, the European Network of Support Services for Persons with Disabilities. Of course, it would have been much better, and that was initially also the plan, to meet in person and to have a very lively interactive debate in Brussels or somewhere else in Europe, but that seems to be impossible in times of COVID-19. So we tried to organize our discussion online, and in the meantime, we have a bit of experience in that, so I really believe that this can be a very interesting afternoon for all of us. Welcome, dear participants. Welcome, dear project partners. It is a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. Dear colleagues, dear friends, the right to a high-quality inclusive education, as it is described in Article 24 of the UN Convention, is not yet a reality for all children with support needs with disabilities. Although we know that access to high-quality inclusive education is a key requirement for having good access to the labor market afterwards and to be able to enjoy active participation in society, it is still far from a reality for all children. And we also know by experience, and also in this project, this became clear once again, we know that system change is needed. We know that retraining of professionals and teachers that might be needed. And we also know that work with the children themselves and with parents, of course, is essential. In times of COVID-19, in this corona crisis, it became even clearer that special educational needs, special support is not yet provided to all those that need it. And that was very clear during the lockdown of the education system. Quite often, this type of support was not provided for children that had to follow education online. And I must say that quite often also poorer parents or families that have no access to digital platforms and technology, their children were excluded from special educational support. So this crisis made clear that indeed there are a few structural weaknesses in our system. Change is needed, and that is what we will discuss this afternoon, and that is part of our project on inclusive education. Change is needed, policy is needed, and that is why we also invited some colleagues from the European Parliament representing MEPs also to join us. Education is competence of the member states. We all know that. Still, we are convinced that the European level can do a lot, leading the way, showing how the change can be implemented, can be an important role for the European authorities. We will discuss all this. All the stakeholders are on board, so I wish you a very interesting debate, very interesting conversation during this afternoon, and I'm sure that this will help us to bring the change that is needed for children with support needs. Why? Because they should be empowered in such a way that they can take part in society like everybody else. On this note, I would like to hand over to Rachel, who is leading this project on behalf of ESPD, together with other partners, of course. Rachel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So if I just share my screen. So as Lucas said, this policy debate is held in the framework of the IE Plus project, otherwise known as the Promoting Positive Attitudes and Evidence-Based Policy for Inclusive Education. So it's a 3-year Erasmus Plus project, which aims to provide decision makers, so here policymakers and education providers, with the information, training and tools that allow for evidence-based policy making. The project is focused on realising Article 24 of the UNCRPD, and specifically we've looked at how we can foster more inclusive education systems, specifically for learners with intellectual disabilities, as these are quite often the learners who are most excluded from the mainstream school system. When we're talking of inclusion here, what we mean is every person having the same possibilities to enjoy a high quality education without being segregated. And the framework of the education system changes to adapt to the needs of the learner, applies attitudes, approaches and strategies that include all learners in all activities, regardless of their support needs, with respect to their individual learning level. So that IE Plus project has brought together partners from across 5 different European countries, in Belgium, Bulgaria, Spain, Greece and Portugal. And the main activities of the project has been conducting research into the common barriers hindering the transition towards inclusive education, and then using what we have learned from that study to develop and then implement training for decision makers that can then enable them to create evidence-based policies to overcome these challenges. So looking a little into our study, as this has sort of been the basis for our future work, and also the key areas that we have wanted to focus on for this policy debate. The aim of our research was to understand the reality of school for children with disabilities and the problem in the implementation of policies for inclusive education. So it addressed inclusive education in our 5 partner countries, so Belgium, Bulgaria, Spain, Greece and Portugal. We had to take care. Obviously, our societies are all characterised by diversity, and as a result, it's important to give attention to the history and context that each individual country experiences, and this shows through in their education systems, their policies and their practices. And while we took care not to try and oversimplify this culture and context, it was clear that there were several common barriers that we found across these countries that prevent the progress of multiple EU member states moving towards inclusion. So I just want to present these a little more deeply before we move on to our debate and how we can overcome these challenges. So our first one was continued negative or poor attitudes towards disability and inclusion. We found that the medical model, where disability is viewed as an impairment or a difference that needs to be fixed, is still quite strong. And this is often pushed by the need to diagnose or label a learner's disability before we consider reasonable accommodations or support measures that can support them to develop to their fullest potential. We also saw that there was an absence of practical action plans to achieve inclusion. So many countries do have the legislation there for inclusive education, but there's no clear way forward in how that legislation can be implemented on a practical level to realise the legislation. The need for hard data was another common barrier that we identified. So there's a lack of statistics, especially for children with intellectual disabilities, on the reality or inclusion of learners in mainstream schools. And this lack of data prevents us from more deeply analysing the state of inclusive education and our progress, and it also hinders our ability to provide a greater insight into the outcomes of children connected to their schooling. The continuation of segregated special education is another key barrier that we identified, and it sort of creates a parallel model where you have funding for both mainstream schools and special education schools. And this means that these schools have to compete for funding and resources, and it can mean it's a lot more difficult for mainstream schools who are trying to become more inclusive to get the resources and the support they need to do that. And then a final key barrier that we want to address in this policy debate is working in silos and collaborating with stakeholders. So the realization of inclusive education requires the cooperation of multiple stakeholders, including teachers, therapists, support workers, the children themselves, their families, local authorities. But many problems occur because these planned interventions, medical treatment or the school system don't work together. They continue to work in traditional silos and they struggle to move past these disciplinary boundaries. So it can sometimes be reinforced by the budget of the way that a school's budget is structured, but it's clear we need to start to move beyond these silos to be able to work towards more inclusive education. So the next hour and a half, we want to hear the perspective of different stakeholders in a discussion to see how we can move forward, how we can address these barriers, and particularly looking at what can be done at a European level to promote more inclusive labour systems. And we want these to feed into the policy recommendations of our project, which we will present at the end of this event. So with that, I will hand over for our first panel, looking at the attitudes toward disability inclusion and working in silos, with Tim as moderator. So I'll pass over to Tim. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, we look here at inclusive education, and one of the common reference when we talk about education, as Luke mentioned, it's a member state issue. It's different in every country, and it's a way to say, well, we can't do anything about it. What it boils down often to is that, yes, the system is different in every country, and yes, member states have a role to play, yes, the EU and teachers and policymakers and families, but all it means is we need to have better attitude towards inclusive education. It boils down to how can we work together, not individually and say it's not my responsibility, it's the others, but how can we work together to improve attitude, to improve ambitions towards inclusive education. If we want to have better action plan, if we want to have better data, if we want to move away from segregated special education, not one organization can do it alone. We need to work together. So in this panel, we will work together with some representative persons with disabilities, service providers, families, to look at how to overcome this negative approach to inclusive education. Our first panelist is Ellen Portal from Inclusion Europe. And so you might all know that the new European Disability Strategy that is being discussed after 2020. So Ellen, could you tell us more about how this strategy can help promote more positive attitude and how the EU can promote a better positive attitude for inclusive education in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm Helen, the Policy and Advocacy Officer at Inclusion Europe, which is the European movement of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. The topic of inclusive education has been at the heart of our work for several years now. So I will give you first a short overview of our work, and then our concerns and on the next EU disability strategy and how it can help towards more positive attitudes on inclusive education. And finally, I think it's inevitable to mention the coronavirus crisis. So first on our work, in many European countries, children with intellectual disabilities and children with complex support needs are actually at risk of being left behind and excluded from education. Exclusion may not be intentional, but it's the result from implicit policies which regard children with intellectual disabilities and complex support needs as non-educable, too difficult, or too expensive to include in the general education system. And this is why at Inclusion Europe, we consider that there's education and segregated education. This means that we shouldn't speak of inclusive education, but rather only education, where all the people are included and learning together. And Inclusion Europe has been working on the subject for quite a long time and participated in projects such as the one Rachel mentioned, IE+ project. We also did an exploratory study on the inclusion of pupils with complex support needs in mainstream schools. And it was and it still is the theme of focus of our year. We were supposed to have a conference in Vienna, but sadly it was cancelled. And as for the next EU strategy, Inclusion Europe thinks that the issue of legal capacity and segregation needs to be explored because deprivation of legal capacity affects all the areas of life and prevents people from making decisions that are affecting their lives and choices, such as the possibility to study in mainstream education system together with others. And this strategy, while it has to establish clear targets and objectives, it should also secure part of the EU funds to be allocated to the implementation of this strategy, such as accessible and inclusive education. Inclusion Europe believes it's important to change the communication around inclusive education, to dismantle the existing stereotypes and the prejudices that exist on inclusive education. And from the coronavirus crisis, we really saw that it highlighted the fact that little education was offered to children with intellectual disabilities, and sometimes even no education at all to children with severe intellectual disabilities and complex support needs. Plus, there was no support dedicated to learners, parents, and relatives, and they were left without help. The technology was inaccessible, and their routines changed drastically. So we should learn the lessons from this crisis and avoid mistakes when starting schools again. And responsible authorities must ensure that online teaching is provided in an accessible way, inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities. And there should be an adequate transition for each student with intellectual disability to be put in place by schools in order to allow them to start school again soon. So to conclude, it's very important to take into consideration these lessons for the next EU strategy, and those the problems we saw from this crisis should be seen now as opportunities in order to ensure that the ways of delivering education in the future will be innovative, and things do not simply go back to the way they were before, when many learners with intellectual disabilities were actually segregated and not provided with any education at all, so as to make it completely inclusive of learners with intellectual disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really easy for a job of moderator when you keep slow all the time. Thank you so much. For a reminder for the audience, you can ask your questions to the panelists in the Q&A at the bottom, or eventually in the chat. and then we'll ask after the three speakers all your questions, and we can have a conversation there. It's a policy debate, so I hope you will all be joining me in asking questions. So thank you indeed. Like, EDS is the best opportunity to answer the issue we've seen during the COVID crisis, and ensuring that inclusive education is also, as you said, a normal education that reaches for all, also reaches children with intellectual disabilities and other children are further away from education. We'll go then to Ms. Irene Bestana from Coface Families Europe, where we will have the perspective of families that are crucial when we talk about education. We cannot imagine bringing children to school if you don't have the support of the parents, if you don't provide the necessary support to the parents, and if they are not on board, both parents of children with disabilities and parents of other children. So, Irene, can you tell us what are the key barriers to inclusive education for the parents, and how can the EU better support the cooperation between parents and teachers?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tim. So, first of all, I would like to shortly introduce Coface Families Europe, that you might all know. We are a European network of family organizations, and we have a platform of members that support and represent families with persons with disabilities. And we are advocating as well for inclusive systems towards every pupils. So we did some work on disability, but we are doing something in parallel on migration to pass the same kind of values. We believe that that education is a family project in the first place, but that also parents, family members, and community structure and schools are all influencing the process of the children to reach or not their full potential. So they are all stakeholders that should be interacting towards the inclusion and the meeting of the needs of children. If we want to reach inclusive society and thus respect conventions of human rights that the EU and the member states signed, we need the families, we need to have the political will of this. So I totally support what was said by Inclusion Europe in terms of changing the approach towards disability and the understanding of disability by society. And then, from the family perspective, the families need to trust the public authority and the education system to be able to identify and respond to their needs and to the needs of their children. Of course, this crisis is underlying what was already happening, so a structural lack of will to include children with disabilities in the mainstream educational system. So we had some exchange with our members as well, and there are problems that were there already and new problems that are emerging, which were underlined before, of general lack of accessibility of platforms for long distance education, for example, and of contents that can be not accessible for some of the children with some learning disabilities, and for those children who have sensorial impairments and, for example, deaf children who cannot follow content as everyone else. So in our view, education must take into account the needs of all, putting the child at the center, and be developed with an holistic, comprehensive, and right-based approach. And also not only looking at what is the compulsory education, but for the whole life, from the early education to university. So when we talk education, we mean this. And we have, in this sense, some tool that we developed as well. The main one that we developed last year is called Shift, and it wants to be a guide for policymakers, but for every stakeholder, in order to make societies more inclusive. So I tried to pick some of the tools and the actions that were there in order to give some guidance. And in this sense, for sure, information, the parents need to be able to identify and respond to the needs, so they need to be supported in this. And for this, they need information on their rights and on the existing support, also training in order to be able to be part of it, and network. So family, parents, family carers need to be part of networks in order to create the policies. Second, the staff need to know why and how to provide education that fits every pupil. So in this sense, again, the training, another kind of training which puts the inclusion at the center, is fundamental, and on how to then physically provide accessibility is really key for us. And then another very important thing is that the situation of the parents, the eventual exclusion of the parents, must not be a barrier for the children to access the education. So in this sense, financial support to families is also, is also fundamental. And in this moment, for example, providing IT connection, IT devices is fundamental, assisted devices is fundamental, work-life balance and leaves for those, for this transition moment when schools are not open in some cases is fundamental. And yeah, just final words, partnership, making it real, starting from the intention of creating an inclusive environment is a way probably to make this happen, because all the knowledge and all the skills are there. It's just a matter of making them interacting in a positive way.
Thank you very much. Indeed, as you said, considering partnerships, as you said, staff training, having the parents involved and supporting the inclusion with providing IT connection, assistive device, but it's working together. In that regard, the service providers can be sometimes that bridge between the school and the parents. So we have here Miguel Valeix from CECD Miracintra in Portugal. And we talk often of co-production, which means like developing, designing, implementing the service together with parents, with schools, with the service provider, with the children. So as service providers, Miguel, what recommendation can you give to go beyond stakeholders working in silos, but to promote this co-production in the education of learners with disabilities?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Miguel from CECD Miracintra in Portugal. Thank you for presenting me, Tim. It's so nice to see that over 50 participants are online and already chatting and discussing this. So we are a service provider. We support mainstream schools around the Great Lisbon area, and we were a former special school. So just a quick state of play in Portugal. We had a very radical shift from having this special schools model, and in 3 years, it was a very drastic measure for the government to say this was a national policy, to say that in 3 years, most special schools should reconvert themselves into resource centers to support inclusion. So this was a very drastic way, and this resulted in for instance, the quick reconversion stated that all regular mainstream schools should accommodate children with disability. So they're local schools. So in the neighborhood, everyone should be able to be in their local school. So this instantly made us spread a bit of the service we provided. It made us contact with many different realities from schools, and our focus quickly was shifted from being focused on the children needs and the children process and rehabilitation that we was ones provided to an actual support to schools, to teachers, to the school community. So this made us a changing agent. So our role now is to better prepare schools to accommodate their processes and to accommodate their way of teaching to everyone's needs. And the result, after 10 years of this work, what we see now is, by working in the classrooms with our therapists, with our psychologists, with our social workers, speech therapists, occupational therapists, everyone being present in the classroom, helping and working together with the teacher, not only help the child with a disability or a child with a severe needs, but it benefited everyone on that classroom. So these by allowing us to be present in school, in mainstream schools, I think we offered a different view and a different way of teaching and interacting, not only with those with a disability, but for everyone. So we would love to see a more positive attitude towards children with disabilities, but this is not yet achieved. So in some cases, schools have some benefits from having children with disability in the classroom. They got a reduced classroom. Instead of 28 children, they get only 22 children per classroom if they integrate a child with a disability, for example. And this should, it is a necessary policy. I'm not saying that it is not, but some reactions from schools, we sense that they use these children with disabilities to get a better benefit from the ratio teacher to students, but we haven't. So what we need now are better policies and better ways of working, so that really school community can see children with disabilities as a plus, as this a very important reality that benefits all, and a different way of teaching that benefits everyone. So this is the process that we are in now. About the new, this is I'm seeing some comments here. The reaction of the COVID-19, it is overwhelming. It impacts more severely those who have special needs, but we are working with schools to work with teachers how to reach those who are in home, and especially prepare their return in the next school year. So thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. So for the three speakers for their presentation. So indeed, focusing on the benefits of having the education, that you can benefit to all children and have a better education in the end. As you had said in a previous meeting, that it's just better education, you reach better all the students, not just the students with disabilities, if you make accessible content, accessible platforms. It's better the results for everyone. So we have now a few questions, so I will turn again to the panelists, and I will start with Irene. We've seen comments that sometimes the parents prefer to go to special schools, and they themselves are afraid of mainstream school. And so I don't know if you have any experience in that and from your network. And so Miguel, in Portugal, I believe that it's the parents that have to make a request for not going to mainstream school. So if you could also after bring a comment on that, Irene.
Yes, Yeah, actually, this was some of the themes of reflection for our workshop this year, and we were planning to have a meeting in Milan, in Monza, in order to show the Italian model, which is for a long time where the inclusion in the mainstream is the rule and the special education is the exception, to show how it is. So we are aware that there is, in particular for the countries that don't have a long experience, fear and of leaving children in a context where there is not enough support. We are very much in line with the approach that was the example given of Portugal, because also, like for example in Luxembourg, we have very good examples of this kind of interaction in between the former special education and system and the mainstream. So for sure, the idea of giving resources and training and know-how to the teacher is a very important tool to move towards an inclusive system. When the structure are in place, the correct funding is in place, and the children can interact, it's more easy that the families won't be resisting this change. Yeah. But it is a matter of fact that if the inclusive education is phrased in this way in the UN Convention, this means that this is the way that we need to get all together, rather than, I mean, its choice is fundamental, but it's important that the public gives something of high quality to every children, and not that those who can choose the best option with all the possible support, and those who cannot because they don't have the means or the knowledge are excluded. Yep. I don't know if I did answer. Yep. I hope so.
Thank you. Just also for panelists, you can go into Q&A, you can see the questions. So I'm not sure we'll have time to answer all of them. So for example, I see the third question for Miguel, if you also could answer written in that direction so that we can focus on the other questions. So for example, we have a question for Human Rights Watch, Emina Selimovic. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. So how with the COVID and the end of the COVID, with the reopening of the schools, what is happening to children with support needs now that they go back to school or not? And I think a very good question for our policy debate: what is the one most important thing that the EU can do and that we should be pushing them to ensure right to inclusive, high quality education for kids with disabilities? Very easy, very focused question. What's the one thing? So maybe we can go first to Ellen. If you had one thing that the EU can do to push for inclusive education.
Yeah, me. So I think that putting it as a priority in the next disability strategy, it's possibly a good start, and raising the necessity of inclusive education also through the funding, the European funding for the next budget are two important points, and eventually, I know it's three, a recommendation or some sort of initiative stating the importance of it is also something that politically could make a difference.
Hélène?
Yes, I think Irene said basically said the three main ideas. It would be indeed important to have funds dedicated to education, inclusive education, rather than funding segregated education, and yes, that would be it.
Thank you. And for Miguel, also, if you could say what is happening for children now that they have to go back to school?
Yes.
Can they go back, or what is the situation?
There is some possibility for them also already be at school. There is a special provision in law that stated that a child can, if there's is in a severe need, a local school will open to receive her. However, they will continue to be enclosed, so it will be a great school, but only with children with disabilities, and this is not what we want. About what would a nice policy for the European Union to support, I would go even further than Helen and say, yes, I agree, support those programs that support mainstream schools, but even in those programs, support them, those that promote inclusive education and positive attitudes. So not all programs that are in place in mainstream schools promote the right notion of inclusion, and mainly those who can have a very clear view of what is positive in including everyone. So this would be, I know that it is not an easy program to support, but for me it's the only way. So the Portuguese way was to, by law, close almost all special schools. It was an approach. It resulted in this. However, if we would change a bit of the strategy, it would take longer. Of course, it wouldn't take only 3 years, but by showing that everyone having an inclusive education with quality is fully supported, I think parents would slowly begin to see those mainstream schools as the better choice for their children. COVID turned things around, because now special schools are open and mainstream schools are closed. So now parents that chose a special schools are being benefited, and this is worrying because they now see that maybe special schools offer a better choice. This is a strange time we're living, but I think this is the positive way to go to.
Thank you. And the last question before I close the panel, from Bulgaria, from now that we're talking about attitudes, it's how the education system can encourage teachers and to help teachers understand the importance of putting the child first, the need of the child with disability, and to build secure relationships, so that they can come on board the inclusive education process, and because it's often felt as extra work put on them. So Miguel, you've talked about that now the focus shifts to supporting the schools, and so in your experience, and if other panelists want to come in, what's the most successful tip to get teachers on board and encourage them to make the shift in the active actors? Yeah, Miguel, go ahead.
I was trying also to, this is multitasking, and we are not great at multitasking. I was trying to have a discussion here by text. We have to allow a teacher to reach for help, and the way to put this is, if a teacher addresses a service provider, any service, even special school teacher, special teacher in school, and focus the reason for their worries as, I have a child who has a problem. This shouldn't be addressed like this. So we have to change, and we have to support the teacher that starts to see that as a teacher, I have a problem. As a teacher, I have a problem because I have a child there who learns a bit differently, and only this shift allows to not focus on the disability of the child. So it's not the child that has a problem, it is a teacher that has a problem because I lack the tools to address the needs of the child. And this way we can support the teacher. If the teacher doesn't make the shift of addressing a child's problem or a child's disability, you know, the need of categorization, so that now, okay, I have a diagnosis, so now I can have accommodate to the curriculum or change a bit of the learning style. We have to work with the teacher and the school community and reverse things. And so the focus now is on the teacher, because he wants to teach something to that child and he lacks the tools, and this way we can help him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Working together, I think the last word, with the family, with the teachers, with the services, with the children and the parents. Thank you all the panelists. A reminder, the question and Q&A, so please don't hesitate to go answer it by written if you want to delve more into it. Thank you again also to the audience for the questions that you brought up. Next panel will be chaired by Milan Zverepa from Inclusion Europe. Thank you again all for your attention.
Good afternoon from me as well. Thank you, Tim, for handing over to me. The name is Milan Zverepa. I'm Director of Inclusion Europe. I will be chairing this the second panel of this webinar, and we'll start this panel by with a presentation by Quentin Callens from the Belgian equality body UNIA. And I think that before he gets into talking about what steps Belgium in particular needs to take to move from segregated to inclusive schools, I think that Belgium is an example to follow up on one of the questions. There are also countries that didn't open special schools I mean, Czechia would be another. There was a lot of work to ensure that they actually, children with disabilities who are attending special schools get to get any education at all. And I believe that Belgium is another example of countries that haven't opened special schools so far. But Quentin, please take the floor, and maybe you will have better information than I do about the situation in this country.
Yes, thank you, Milan. Thank you for having me on this panel. Well, Belgium, indeed, first of all, Belgium does not have one education system. We have several regions and communities. I follow up the Flemish situation, so I cannot speak for the French-speaking part of Belgium. But in the Flemish part of Belgium is actually one of the most segregated education systems in Europe. The cross-country report of 2016 from the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, according to that report, almost 8% of pupils in Flanders follow special education. So the road towards one inclusive education system is a very, very long road, and we have many steps to take in order to reach that one inclusive education systems. As for the corona pandemic in Flanders, yes, indeed. The thing is that some schools have opened partially, some schools have closed partially. It's all depending on the type of pupils that are in the schools. It's depending on the age of the children, whether they can maintain the social distancing, and so it's a quite a complex situation. But indeed, the special schools have lagged behind in the opening. But most schools now have started reopening again. But so to get towards this one inclusive education system in Flanders, I think we don't need small steps, but we need one gigantic mental leap. It's to recognize and accept that inclusive education is the way forwards, that is the way we need to follow, that there's no real alternative. But what we see now, and we've always seen so far, is that politicians are debating the desirability and the feasibility of inclusive education, we keep hearing people questioning whether inclusive education is really in the child's best interest. Although there's enough scientific evidence to support inclusive education, there's an international consensus about it, there's a human rights convention on the need for inclusive education, and we're still discussing this. It's actually mind-boggling. But we believe that one of the main reasons for this is that we actually have no long-term strategy. We have no long-term strategy as to how we are going to go from from the two systems we have now to this one inclusive education system. And the opponents of inclusive education are conveying this false image that we want to close all special schools today and drop all the pupils with special education needs in regular schools tomorrow. And well, of course, that will not work. So to counter this narrative, we really need a long-term strategy consisting of small steps. This way, inclusive education will not be this big, scary threat, but it might become something which is realistical and which is attainable. So we believe that's one very important thing. The second thing within this strategy, we believe, is to get the teachers on board. In the end, you can have all the politics, the political decisions you want. If the teachers do not believe in the inclusive education and the possibilities it brings, well, you'll never really get there. Which was why we were quite surprised. We had a study done in 2016 and 17. The results were published in 2018, and this study showed that a large majority of teachers, they state that they are willing to accept children with an intellectual disability in their classes, but the problem, they say, is that in the current context they are not equipped to do so. As Miguel said, they do not know who they can call on if they realize that they don't manage to reach a certain pupil. They aren't necessarily aware of their own limits. They are alone in a big class, so it's very difficult for them to realize inclusive education. So we believe that the one very important step is to get the teachers on board, and to do this, we need to equip the teachers. We need to train the teachers on how to manage a class which is very diverse, more diverse than what they're used to. We need to train teachers in different ways to provide their course, different ways to transfer the knowledge they're trying to transfer. We need to look into the way teachers evaluate pupils as well, because evaluation still is a very important part of the schooling. You need to take a look into which progress is the pupil making. You need to evaluate that. And we need to allow for pupils and to allow for teachers to be very creative in the way that they are evaluating their pupils, because the goal of evaluation is for a pupil to show the progress he or she has made. So you don't need to limit it to a paper, a written test. There's different ways to show you've mastered certain knowledges. So to achieve all this, it's necessary to make the shift from a classical classroom where the teacher is just standing in front of the room, talking for 1 hour, and then sending the pupils home with some homework. That classical setting, it doesn't work no more. Well, it can work for a certain amount of time and for some parts of transmitting knowledge or for some aspects within the class, but having that as the sole and the main setting within class, it doesn't work anymore. But in order to change towards other settings, we really need to train the teachers. But this is a fundamental change. It's a fundamental change in the way the teachers take up their role. So we need to allow teachers to learn these necessary skills to provide inclusive education. And that also implies knowing the limits of your own skill set is also very important. As Miguel just said, that teachers need to know who they can call on if they realize that they've attained the limits of their own capabilities. What we see now, however, is that as soon as a labeled child gets in a class, the teachers call for help. So they just look at the label and they don't even think about what they could do to help a certain child. So that is, I don't want to blame all the teachers with this. It's very important to know that a lot of teachers really try really hard, but if you're in a class with 25 children, it's a very difficult situation. So it's a chain of events that need to change. But we believe that if you give the teachers the necessary skills to provide more inclusive education, that will give them the confidence to accept more children with special needs within the class. It will also give the parents of those specific pupils the confidence that putting their child, the confidence that changing their child from special education to regular education, to inclusive education, will be beneficial for their child as well. Because now I saw one of the comments earlier was that
Thank you, Quentin. I think I'll need to wrap up and move to other speakers. So thank you very much. I think it was
I got caught up in the moment again.
No, I think it was definitely worth listening to as you got caught up in the moment. It was, thank you for your contribution. Let's move on to another speaker, and that is member of the European Parliament, Stelios Kimpuropoulos, who will talk about his role as an MEP in ensuring that the European Pillar of Social Rights is properly implemented and also contributes to promoting inclusive education, training, and lifelong learning. So,
I don't think
Mr. Kimpuropoulos.
I don't know if we can move on to the next speaker and then give him a bit more time. I've contacted his office to see if he's having any problems, but maybe we can move on to the next speaker. Sorry.
Oh, and such a great introduction and to nothing. So I'll try, give it another try. And that speaker is here, right?
Yeah, so Josephine.
Okay. So we'll move on to Josephine Hederström from DG Employment, Social Affairs and Social and Inclusion at the European Commission. And she will talk about the, let's say, new and what people in our line of work would call exciting initiative and proposal from the European Commission, and that is the child guarantee. So the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. I just want to check that you see me and hear me, and then I would like to share my screen with you to show you a PowerPoint presentation.
We hear you well.
Super. So let me see here. Let me share my screen with you. There we go. Do you see my slides now?
Yes, it's on.
Okay, so I don't know how this works, if I can see chat questions while I'm speaking, but then bear with me and I'll address them later on then. So for those of you I have not met, hello, I am Josephine Hederström. I work in DG Employment in the units for disability, or working with disability issues, as well as social inclusion. I will be rather general because the Commission is working on these things, but we are at an early stage, so we are very much in a listening mode. So we're happy to hear views, but of course I'm happy to take questions from you. I will also try to be brief. Let me see the next slide. I will be speaking about policy activities. So we also have recently adopted new funding in the MFF and ESF Plus, where there are funding possibilities, but I am not the best placed to be speaking about those, so I will focus on the policy issues. I will be very brief also on the COVID-19, because I heard that that was mentioned by the previous speakers. So just very briefly, some priorities that we have seen to address the social consequences of COVID-19. There you may know that there was a recovery package adopted by the college on the 27th of May. So what does this say? Well, it says that we need to preserve the jobs and promote quality job opportunities for all. So it's not for a selective few, but really to have a social inclusion aspect when it comes to the jobs, and contributing to fair working conditions also for all. Then we also want to reinforce social protection and fighting poverty more generally. What is our compass for this? Well, it is still the European Pillar of Social Rights. So this remains the overarching policy framework that we're working on. We know that the Commission recovery package focuses a lot on jobs, simply for the reason that we know that COVID-19 and the lockdown has had and will have impacts on employment and jobs. But we will try to do this not only to focus on unemployment, but really also to have a social inclusion aspect of this. To give you some examples of initiatives that the Commission is taking, we will have a dedicated action plan for the European Pillar of Social Rights. This will come in 2021. And as you know, the pillar has numerous principles, including for persons with disabilities. I will touch on the two next bullets more in detail, the Child Guarantee and also on the European Disability Strategy. We also see, which I think is of interest also for you, is that there will be work on the demographic changes that we are facing, that we will have a population which is aging. And then there is a range of other initiatives that I will not touch upon. So on the Child Guarantee, this is something that we are working on. You may know that there is some money foreseen in the MFF and ESF Plus for the member states to allocate money to the fight of child poverty. What we are working on is a policy initiative on the Child Guarantee to be adopted in 2021. The way we see it is that the situation of children very often depend on the situation of the parents. So if you are poor as a child, that is because the parents are poor. So you cannot disentangle the two. We see the Child Guarantee will form part of a broader framework on poverty, and there will also be a strategy that my colleagues in DG Justice are working on the rights of the child. So from our perspective, while the Child Guarantee is an initiative on its own right, we don't work in silo and we don't see it as an initiative in its own right, but rather one brick in a bigger building. In terms of substance, the Child Guarantee will not be for all children, it will be for children in need. And this includes children with disabilities. Another issue is that it focuses on access to services. So this is explained, set out in the communication that the Commission did in January this year, that it will be a number of services that we want to ensure access to, including education. So we have early childhood education and care, education, healthcare, services helping to nutrition, and services helping to housing. And as I said, access to services in its own will not solve everything. You need to have an integrated and more broad approach, which we will do together with a number of initiatives. So we are working on this now, and what will happen next? Well, we will have consultations with stakeholders, including with many of you. In parallel, we are working also on the preparatory actions. So for those who, if you're already familiar with this, and I say things that you already know, I apologize, but there is a parallel work that we are doing, which is the preparatory action on the Child Guarantee. So this is something that was requested by the Parliament in 2017, where they asked the Commission to look into the possibility of a Child Guarantee, and from their perspective at the time, it was more a funding instrument, and they asked us to look into the possibilities of this. We have done three, this is divided into three phases. The first phase is on the feasibility of a Child Guarantee. So what are the problems at national level, what can be done? And this phase is finished. There was a conference about this in February, and the final report is to be uploaded on our website as we speak. The second phase is ongoing. It's looking more at the costs. So to ensure access to services, how much will it cost for society? And here, for me, it goes without saying that even if there is funding foreseen in ESF Plus, this is mainly the responsibility of the member states, and national funding is essential. There is no EU money in the world that will cover all of this. The last phase of this preparatory action will start this summer, and this is to be conducted by UNICEF, and they will try a series of initiatives on the ground in a few selected member states and test how things work in practice. And the idea of this is, of course, to see things that work well that can be then moved to other member states and other regions. These are the policy, the initiative that we are working on, and the preparatory actions are two separate things and parallel things. But of course, we look very carefully into the findings of the preparatory action, and the findings there will feed into the Commission's policy initiative. The second thing I want to mention, that has been mentioned already by a few of you, is on the European Disability Strategy, which we are also working on now. We have the idea to present a strengthened new European Disability Strategy to the College in early 2021. So we're working on this now. I cannot give you a more detailed content simply because we are working on it, and it will come as soon as we can. It will build on the evaluation of the existing strategy, which has been discussed. We also have feedback from external stakeholders. We will have more feedback from external stakeholders because we will consult, including several of you. We also look at the other priorities of the Commission that will feed in to shape the new European Disability Strategy. This strategy will remain the main instrument to implement the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I see I've done a spelling mistake on my slide, and I apologize. And also with this one is that it is not to be seen in isolation. It will be coherent and work together with other initiatives that we are doing. There is a gender strategy, there is a children's rights strategy, there is a child guarantee strategy, etc. I will stop there and give you time for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I will take questions in a couple of minutes and we'll also look at what questions have been posted in chat. But at this moment, we have MEP Stelios Kampouropoulos with us now. So without further ado, I will hand it over to him and to make his contribution. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello to all distinguished participants of this debate. Thank you for your invitation to such a complex but also an interesting issue. And Nelson Mandela once said, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. It is an important factor in changing people's mindset. Inclusive education is a model that removes barriers preventing social groups for full participation in society, such as disabled people, Roma, etc. So far, as an MEP, together with my excellent colleagues from the EPP group, have submitted the first oral question to the Commission about the EU Disability Strategy after 2020. Among others, it included a section about the Commission's strategy to make education truly accessible and inclusive for all. On the European Day of Persons with Disabilities in 2019, an article of mine was published in the paper The Parliament, stating that we are in need of an inclusive educational design. In October, I arranged a tripartite meeting between the high-tech industry, representatives of the Greek disability movement, and representatives of the Greek government, so to allow them to see the tools that truly work for optimal inclusion. In addition, I had the honor to be the EPP rapporteur for the corresponding resolution of EU Disability Strategy post-2020. I added amendments that I believe the notoriously workaholic ESPD team has tracked concerning inclusive education and particularly about measures that the member states should take in order to make inclusive education function, and another one calling the Commission support the coordination for the adoption of the right measures for inclusive education. As you can see, I strongly believe that the EU can and should play an active role in making inclusive education a reality through directives and guidance for the member states. In addition, I'm in favor of calling the Commission to work on partnerships between education ministries, the civil society, and the private sector with a view to jointly providing a framework for inclusion in education. It would not be too bold to expect a consultation that would lead to a new legal dimension proposal from the Commission. In order for our common goal to become a reality, there is a need for work and actions inside and outside the school. The EU needs to encourage local and community actors to a change of attitudes and approaches for an environment without exclusions through community awareness. We need actions in the community because education and school are part of the community. We cannot make a real difference without the participation of the community. We also need to invest on mainstream education and make the mainstream education infrastructure more accessible to everyone. One thing is for sure, every child has the right to attend its neighborhood school. That is an important goal, and to achieve that we need reliable data. We need the private sector to work with public authorities and sectors to provide all the equipment needed for an inclusive education. On the other hand, teachers need training in inclusive education and digital literacy. In terms of lifelong learning, I believe that MOOCs are a good opportunity for everyone to advance their knowledge and skills remotely and at their own pace. A tool we need to invest in and make as inclusive as possible for everyone. Finally, I would like to emphasize that we are not the same, and we don't have to be. We need to always embrace our diversity and feel privileged to have it. We all have rights to quality and inclusive education, training, and lifelong learning. Clearly, there is a room for improvement. We need to reflect on our projects in order to be more effective. Please do share with me your views and email me, particularly if you have any questions you would like to ask the Commission. This is the favored MEP's sport. Once again, do email me. Thank you all for doing this event and webinar.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. And now time to take some questions from in the chat. So I would like to encourage everyone, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat so we can read them and ask the panelists to answer them. And it looks like we've just received one. How can teachers be better supported in a local public school? And maybe I think we could go back to Josephine and ask what would be the idea of the child guarantee, all the other programs that Commission is promoting, and how that will actually contribute and to inclusion at a local level.
So there you go. As I said on the child guarantee, and I want to say that just to manage expectations, the child guarantee will not solve everything. It will address a very broad range of children to a very broad range of services. We also have other tools. There will be several packages coming also from the colleagues in DG EAC on inclusive education. We will, in the Child Guarantee, address education, including for children with disabilities. Exactly how this can be done, it is too soon to be said. I agree with you that the teacher needs to be better supported in local public school, but here the step is very, very far also, that we have national level, regional level and local level, and a very large diversity in the EU, with a lot of diversity between the educational systems and how they are set up in the different regions and different areas. So to come with a magic wand and say, this is how it should be done in all the local areas, I think is very challenging. I will keep my answer in that generalist way now, but I will say that we do see this as a very important issue, and we do work with our colleagues in DG EAC on this.
Thank you. Speaking of magic wands, we have another question, maybe more specific, very specific. How to make the European Agency for Special Needs Education a more active promoter of inclusive education? And it's directed at you working at the European Commission, but I think we can also ask the same question the MEP as the elected representative of European citizens. So how can the European Agency for Special Needs be made more active promoter of inclusive education, Mr. Kamporopoulos?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that it's on the hands of MEPs to be more supportive on this issue of creating a bigger awareness on Commission in European Parliament, that everyone is useful in society and civil society, and therefore we need to take measurement to insert amendments that we create the appropriate legislation to be acceptable for everyone. So I think that more MEPs that know about the topic of for education for all, it's better for our future and for disabled people.
Thank you. And one last question, and maybe we can, it's a quite simple one, so we can ask both of you, should a school have higher budget if they welcome students with disabilities? Josephine.
To start from my side, I want to return with another question. Why should not all schools welcome students with disabilities? It's just a rhetorical questions. If you want inclusive education, doesn't that mean that they have the same opportunities as all children? Maybe in certain cases there may be needs to have dedicated schools for special needs, but if you want inclusive education, we should really be inclusive, no?
Thank you. Mr. Kamporopoulos.
I totally agree with Mrs. Josephine. We don't need special schools. We don't need special education. We need education for all. And therefore, I don't think that we need special grants for a specific school that in which a student with disability is educated in. So we need to pass legislation which accept an education for all in every school, in any level of education. This would be will be my policy making and my way of acting in the future in European Parliament as a member of European Parliament, but also as as politician and as a citizen, as active citizen in society of Europe. So we need to be together to create this system of education.
Thank you both. I think that was a lot of interesting topics there, and overview also what's happening both in what's a national, half national, speaking of Belgium level and European level. And with that, let me again thank you to all the panelists, and I hand over to Rachel to conclude this webinar.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to all our speakers. We really appreciate it. Thank you for also all of your questions and your comments. So I just move now. As I said at the start, the IE+ project itself has been working on a number of recommendations, and we're hoping that these discussions will feed into these recommendations. So just to have some sort of key messages that we've found. So when we look to European policymakers and how they can support inclusive education, they can support the development of clear and coherent policy frameworks and legislation to promote inclusive education. We've said it's really, really important that this is in cooperation with all stakeholders, people with learning disabilities, families, education providers. As you say, there's a real community that goes into making a school, and all those stakeholders need to take part in that. And the European education area, the child guarantee, and the European disability strategy can all be key EU initiatives that can support this creation of a policy framework and legislation for inclusive education. It's also important that we incorporate additional data collection mechanisms, particularly the European semester, to be able to better follow the development of inclusive education and target learners with disabilities to make sure that they are being included in mainstream education systems. Eurostat and Eurofound can also play a role in that, and it's important that we have civil dialogue there with the sector to make sure we're collecting the right information. The EU should also lead by example, and it should desegregate current and future European schools and include all learners in their classrooms. We've already spoken about how the continuation of two separate education systems can draw away resources. And I think it's also an important step for helping parents and other stakeholders see that inclusive education is the way forward for everybody, and it is the best way to ensure that we give all learners a high quality education. And it's also important that this inclusion is across all levels. And then finally, EU funding programs can play a really important role in supporting inclusive education. We still, for many education systems across Europe, there is changes that need to be made and investment made into education systems to make that happen. For example, the Erasmus Plus project can be a key funding tool with which we can support the training of teachers and other professionals, which has been mentioned several times in this policy debate as a key action that needs to take place if we are to ensure quality education for all learners. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to our speakers and to our moderators, and also to the participants. We encourage you to keep following our project via our webpage, and we'll also be sending you after this this debate policy recommendations, and also the report that we have mentioned. So thank you.